212-209-2950, or give to WBAI.org. Give the numeral 2, WBAI.org. We're continuing on with the programs and with the program day. It is now 5 p.m. Stay tuned for Behind the News, Long Island, with host and producer Sergio Argueta.
Of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. Any language in contrary to this finding is rejected. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. This is Behind the News, Strong Island. It's time.
Check. Hey, yo, it's time. Hey, yo, it's time. It's time. Hey, yo, it's time. We interrupt your programming to bring it to you live from the front lines. Strong Island where the gangs fleeing one time. Police is brutal like the streets is. Let my speech increase the peace through your speakers. Beat our weakness, of course, is division. Caused by religion, race, poor, be in prison way more than the rich ones. The laws of the pawns for position. My flow exposed flaws in the system. Look, you can't afford to be a bystander. Behind the news where the lies die, we strive for high standards. The real power's in the hands of the people. Politics, propaganda, it's all see-through. And that's word that serves. The time is now. For the youth in our roots, gotta stand our ground. Listen Tuesdays at 5. Tune in to 99.5 East Ways. Reporting live behind the news. Give the radio a break from the norm as we advocate for change and reform. Behind the news, unifying while exposing the counterfeits. It's the new voice of empowerment. Behind the new platform for the people it serves, where the truth in your speakers emerge. Behind the news, where politics meet their limitations, you get the real, never imitation. Behind the news. It's time, sweet. It's time, it's time. Long Island, what up?
Buenas noches, familia. Good evening, family, and welcome to WBAI's Behind the News, Long Island. I am your host, Sergio Argueta. Serge, I want to start off by telling you how much I missed you all. It's been 3 weeks since I was last on for a number of reasons, but we're excited to get back on, and we got a lot of great things to talk about today. For those of you tuning in for the first time, this is Behind the News, Long Island. This is a full hour of non-commercial tough talk where 1 hour a week we get together and talk about the Long Island region. 15% of New York State's population, over 3 million people. And we talk about the ripple effect between policies and issues that start up in Albany and trickle down to us and vice versa, and actually impact the rest of the nation and the rest of the state. You can log on and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Behind the News Long Island, or Strong Surge, S-T-R-O-N-G, Surge, S-E-R-G. Today's Tough Talk is still separate and still unequal. We're discussing school segregation. Many of you may know that last year, in March of last year, the UCLA Civil Rights Project found that public school students in New York continue to be severely segregated. They're increasingly isolated by race and class, and the proportion of minority and poor students continue to grow. We know that in 2009, Black and Latino students in the state had the highest concentration in intensely segregated public schools, less than 10% white enrollment, and the lowest exposure of white students in the most uneven distribution, with white students across all schools, heavily impacting those state rankings in New York City, home to one of the largest school systems in the nation. And 60 years after the monumental case, Brown versus the Board of Ed, we're still sending our kids to separate schools. With the most important indicators for success is still closely related to a student's race and socioeconomic class. Tonight we're hearing from two what I call scholactivists. What do I mean by that? Scholars who are actively participating in social justice related issues, not just simply having theoretical debates or engaging in research that has no impact on communities. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce tonight's panelists. Tonight we have Olivia Ildefonso, who's currently a PhD candidate in human geography at the City University of New York's Graduate Center. Her research explores the forms of structural racism in the suburbs with a particular focus on Long Island. She's a consultant for an organization called Erase Racism, where she served as the organization's former housing coordinator and communications coordinator. Olivia, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Sergio.
Listen, we're really excited to have you. We're talking about a very interesting issue, something that's impacting New York State. When folks in New York State think about, segregation, oftentimes they think about down south. They think about places where the Confederate flag still waves, where, individuals are blatantly passing laws that, where you can stop and ask individuals for their papers, for example. But people don't think about New York. Let's talk about it. Can you paint us a picture in terms of school segregation in the state of New York?
Yeah, I think a large reason why people don't think about segregation in New York is because it's so covert here, right? The forms of housing discrimination that have perpetuated school segregation for so long on Long Island just fly under the radar. And, I can tell you from growing up in Bethpage, which now is 92% white and 0.1% black as of the 2010 census data, you grow up not talking about race, not even asking, why am I in school with only other white people? And it's just something that has become so normal because Long Island was founded on racist policies, right? During the suburban boom of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, the Federal Housing Administration only gave out mortgages to white home seekers on Long Island. They systematically denied access to affordable housing on Long Island to blacks. And they also, had policies such as redlining that systematically devalued any neighborhoods that blacks were even present. So you have this history of tying race to property value on Long Island that has just been upheld throughout the decades, right? People still think that if a person of color moves into your neighborhood, your property values are going to decline. And it's amazing, and that's what really is the force behind so much housing discrimination on Long Island, which I said is covert. I mean, you see it coming out in racial steering, and oftentimes people don't even know when they're being racially steered, right?
Well, so let me stop you there. What are we talking about when we talk about racial steering? You're using a lot of jargon. I want to make sure everyone sort of understands. So can you tell us about racial steering? Actually, let's go back to the history piece that you were talking about and the fact that it's covert. A number of individuals talk about de facto segregation, right? The fact that when this decision came down, people assumed that now our schools were actually going to be integrated, and kids from, that looked a particular way would be going to schools with individuals that don't. Why is it that this day and age, 2015, we still don't have that happening?
Because you could have law on the books, but if there's no momentum behind it, if there's no will to institute, to actually uphold these laws, then you're not going to see any change. And sadly on Long Island, there's very little will. Even when you talk about maybe things like consolidating school districts, right? We have 124 extremely racially segregated school districts on Long Island that are also segregated by class. And it's very expensive to uphold a public education system with so many school districts. And it would actually benefit people by consolidating. But when you even mention the C word, consolidation, people freak out, right? They don't want change. Sadly, I think the will isn't there. And the courage isn't there to make change.
A number of folks that are listening to us probably don't know that, we have 124 school districts on Long Island. And, when you think about the New York City Board of Education and you think about how massive the apparatus is, suddenly you shift to a place like Long Island and, some other suburbs throughout New York State, right? Where you have local control. And as a result, the situation is exacerbated, right? You talked about steering. Can you now tie into steering and what that all means? Is it that folks aren't making it to Long Island? We've seen the migration from individuals that, lived and grew up in the boroughs and, they wanted to provide a different type of future for their child, and suddenly they jump on that Long Island Railroad, or they've gotten into a car and they've driven out there and they've seen the beaches and the suburbs, and the idea always is that the suburbs is better. Can you talk about steering? What is it? How does it impact, and how does it exacerbate the issue of segregation in our schools?
Sure. Well, I think one of the biggest myths on Long Island and probably throughout the nation is that if you have enough money to afford a home, you can have access to it. You could buy a home as long as you have enough money to do so. So a lot of the times what you hear is, well, you know, people of color just can't afford to live in this neighborhood. That's why it remains so white. And like I said, that's a myth because of what we can prove with racial steering. When we test for racial steering, right? So there are fair housing organizations working on Long Island that test for steering, which is when a real estate agent will take a black home seeker, for example, a black home seeker and a white home seeker, and say they have the same income, same credit, very similar backgrounds. They say they're looking for similar homes, and they'll steer the black person to a neighborhood of mostly people of color, which on Long Island tends to be high poverty, and a white person to a neighborhood with mostly white people. So this really perpetuates racial segregation on Long Island, and it's illegal, right? But like I said, it's very hard to detect when it's happening. So fair housing organizations send in testers, and they do what's called a pair test to prove that it's taking place. And oftentimes, you know, they find that it could even be so small where, like, say there's a rent, so two testers and they're going to look for apartments. They might just quote the black, you know, potential renter a higher price for the apartment, maybe $200 higher, something like that. Or say that there's, you know, one apartment available in the building when they tell the white home renter that there are two. So these things are really tough to detect, but it has a deep impact on the region.
So where the white individual looking for an apartment or housing is given options, and you know, you have a realtor going out to actually try and rent the property or even sell the property, but we know that they're attempting to dissuade certain individuals from going somewhere, and that's extremely important. When you hear individuals that are in denial, and many of times, you know, these are African American and Latino buyers themselves, right? And they'll make, they'll talk about how they're the exception. Well, I was able to buy a home in Levittown, and I was able to buy a home in Dix Hills. You know, I have the money, I have the credentials, I have the job, the good credit score. And there's folks that might be listening to us right now that are coming up with a laundry list of things that, as to why, you know, we're sort of making this up. What would you say to someone like that?
I would say that you're always going to find exceptions to the rule. And the one that drives me absolutely crazy is, you know, we're post-racial because we have a black president. And of course there's always going to be exception to the rule, but when you look at and what you call structural racism, right, which is systematic, it's something that happens more often than not, or happens often, right? A good example is stop and frisk policies and the ways that African Americans are targeted disproportionately compared to whites. Then, yeah, I mean, even though there are exceptions to the rule, this type of behavior still exists in a way that is systematic, right? And I think just in addition to that, another big myth that not just whites believe, but really a lot of people believe, is that people like to live with other people like them, right? Blacks like to live with blacks, whites like to live with whites, Chinese Americans like to live with other Chinese Americans, and this is really a myth that we've been fed for a long time, right? So people across racial lines do believe that, even though that's not the case when we think about the way that housing discrimination works.
You've done a lot of work specifically around housing and school segregation. Can you tell us school segregation impacts the development of our young people and you know, the opportunities that they'll have in the future? Not only, you know, academic performance-wise, but just in terms of social development.
Yeah, so one thing that I constantly like to bring up or try to bring up when I talk about the negative impacts of school segregation is I think it's maybe more obvious to people the way that it negatively impacts like Black and Latino students on Long Island, for example, because they only have access to high poverty schools that are very, you know, stretched thin in terms of their budget, and they don't have access to a lot of like the high performing programs like the AP programs and things like that. But what people oftentimes don't take into consideration is the ways that it's really harmful for white students who grow up thinking, like really believing in their superiority They succeed in school because they just try harder, not because they're given better resources, right? So just perpetuating stereotypes, which is extremely harmful, outside of just thinking about the individual and individual success, right?
Yeah, I'm also thinking about not only, clearly we need individuals to learn from one another, right? To get to know one another. We inhabit this world. We are responsible for cohabitating and making sure that, especially as citizens of this nation, to make sure that we move it forward. I'm thinking about the detrimental impact that it has on students of color, or in my instance, I grew up in Hempstead, Long Island, and, I currently work in the Uniondale School District. And when we talk about Hempstead, Uniondale, Roosevelt, Wyandanch, Riverhead, certain school districts that do see some diversity, that don't see diversity, are predominantly African American and Latino, and may have large budgets, but they're still constrained. They don't have the technology that's needed. They don't have the professional development in certain instances that teachers need, best practices, a number of different issues. What are some of the things that educators need to start doing to advocate for their students, especially when you think about, Governor Cuomo and the directives that he's given in terms of where he's putting priorities? It's all test. It's teachers' evaluations. What are some of the things that you believe educators need to start doing around this issue?
Well, I think Alan will probably talk about this a little bit more in depth than I can when it comes to pedagogy and just, within schools, what can be done to make changes. But I think people need to start valuing things other than a test score in school, right? I mean, it just becomes so mechanical, just the way that students are, teachers teach for the test, students are valued based on how well they do on a test, and then that's just really the only proxy for success nowadays, and it's not giving them the space to critically think, to engage with one another, right? For the teachers to learn from one another, right? The teachers are also put into competition because they're evaluated based on their students' test scores. So it's this entire environment of just competing with each other and no collaboration and no thinking about the ways that we can learn from one another that I think really needs to be challenged by teachers, by school administrators, by parents.
Going back to the impact that it has on young people, I'm thinking about a number of my students who, kids that are growing up in these communities and they're graduating. And for the first time ever, they're entering higher education, and suddenly they're entering predominantly white institutions. And, where they were the norm and, there was very little diversity, now they're walking into a classroom where there's a particular etiquette that changes, where, now all of a sudden, it's the microaggression that they face, the different challenges that they sort of have to go through. And it kind of starts with desegregating our schools, doesn't it?
Definitely, and I think just the main takeaway that I hope people can learn is school segregation is not good for anyone. I mean, this is really, the ripple effects, like you started out saying, are enormous. Just when it comes to, being able to have access to a good college, to, perpetuating stereotypes, like we said, to even, people talk about it on a much larger scale, the fact that the United States is going to become majority minority, right? That's like the term that they use in a couple of decades. And what does it say if people are still living in segregated environments, right? If we don't know, we feel uncomfortable in environments with, that are multicultural or multiracial. Definitely the ripple effects are large.
When we talk about the blackening and browning of America, which is I think what you were alluding to, and we're constantly thinking about the gains that we've made, and you mentioned the fact that we have an African American president, yet we know that throughout the other levels of government there really hasn't been sort of much gain, many gains, if you will, and you see it throughout a number of social institutions. We know that education is critical to any society. This is where we learn, this is besides our parents and, our families and the social networks we're a part of, the biggest institution that, that young people are guaranteed to engage in is education. What are some of the things that you think we need to actively do to integrate our schools? What are some of the things that the citizens or the parents, we're talking about these issues, but how do we, what are some of the solutions? What are some of the things that we should be looking at?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one thing that I'll kind of poke fun at scholars that we're really good at is identifying problems and not always coming up with solutions, right? But I do think on a larger scale, one of the major things that we have to do is change the way that I think I maybe mentioned this, but just a zero-sum thinking, right? That if someone gets something, say within a school district, if some students get something, that means that some students are losing something, right? It's, the reason why you see so much nativism on Long Island and hostility towards Latino students, because people feel like, well, if they're coming into my school district, then they're probably going to need ESL programs, and if money is going to ESL, then it's going to be going away from these other programs, and it's this zero-sum thinking that is really so dangerous, right? Instead of thinking, what is it that we have in common? Right? What are ways that we can actually work together and make this work for all of us? And what's really fascinating is to look at the way that the recession has impacted school districts on Long Island. And the Long Island Index just came out with a study that showed that the recession negatively impacted most school districts on Long Island, especially the budgets, because you have like the low need school districts, which are low poverty. They were really the only ones that were able to weather the recession. So their budgets increased, in the past 5 years, and the average need school districts, their budgets pretty much leveled off, and the high need, which is the high poverty, their budgets decreased. So if you think of the ways that the school, people can kind of reflect and say, well, if the low need school districts are the only ones that are actually doing well now, that's kind of bad for all of us, right? Because if like the wealthy school districts are the only ones, there's not so many that were able to go unscathed. So I think we have to think about what are the ways that we can see these commonalities, see like how the recession has been harmful for majority of the school districts and make changes, right? Rather than thinking we just have to hold on to whatever we have for dear life and just not let go to this, to the few resources that we have left. It's that type of mentality that is really, really steering us or pushing us in the wrong direction.
I'm trying to think of the elected officials, right, on this matter. And I'm thinking about state representatives. I'm thinking about the local levels of, when we talk bureaucracy, you're talking about 124 school districts on average with 5 to 6 Board of Education members. You're talking about the town of Hempstead, the town of North. You're talking about all these different townships. You're talking about 2 different county legislatures, 2 different county executives. I'm trying to think about what an integration plan would look like, and who are the elected officials that we think would be at the forefront in terms of having these very difficult discussions. And I got to tell you, as I'm hearing you speak, pretty much, I don't know about you, but how does that happen? I'm overwhelmed just thinking about it, and I don't think that anyone would have the political will to even start that discussion.
I think it happens, and this is kind of a sad way of looking at it, but it happens when people become desperate, right? It's when they say, hey, like, I'm just getting by. I'm spending 40% or more of my income on housing, on trying to pay for this school district, which takes up a majority of people's taxes. And does it have to be this way? Do I have to be struggling in order to provide my children with a quality education? And I think in times that desperation actually forms coalitions, right? And it makes people have the courage that they didn't have before to start making changes. And I don't know, maybe I don't see it as that difficult because there is a financial incentive to doing something like consolidating. It doesn't really have to be at the county level. I mean, people have proposed it at the town level. I don't know, I haven't really thought about it on a smaller level than that, but there is a financial incentive. So I think if you can kind of appeal to people on that level, you know, for me, I like to make the moral argument because I'm an advocate for racial justice, and I think that should be our priority, right? But, you know, I'm realistic enough to know that people that, you know, who are struggling, their priority is getting by, and their priority is trying to ensure, you know, offer their kids more than they were offered, for example. You know, offer their kids a great education, etc. So if you kind of appeal to that financial aspect and say, you know, you don't have to be spending a majority of your income, you know, just to provide your kids with a quality of education. There are better ways. Let's think about those. Then yeah, maybe we'll start to see some change.
I'm thinking about intersectionality of class and race, and that's something that you alluded to, and I'm thinking about communities throughout Long Island that, you know, that are in that, you know, they're not overly stressed, right, and they're not too burdened, but you know they're on that line, if you will, and they will be facing some very difficult decisions. I'm thinking about a couple of districts on Long Island that have started discussions around merging as a result of declining student population and enrollment, and in those instances it hasn't worked. When we think about, you know, now using, for example, race and class as the tools that have been used to divide us, and I mean, anyone who's into social justice related issues can talk about finding that common ground. And you're right, people are finding it difficult to pay the taxes and, you know, to go out and shop and, you know, get the basic necessities that they need. And it is your argument then that's really the some of the things that'll bring us together. Because I mean, listen, the moral arguments, I think that if people had, you know, any sense of morality, we wouldn't be dealing with these challenges now. You have a number of school districts that are predominantly of color, where the graduation rate is 38%, 50%, 60, 70%. When a quarter of the population in a community is not graduating, that's a problem that we all have to pay for. So I'm attempting to really think about how we dig in. What are some of the things that throughout your research you've seen that kind of make you feel like we're moving the needle? What are some of those small victories that you've had even in Long Island? I know that there were some lawsuits around housing that were won recently and things of that nature. What are some of those small battles, if you will, that we need to think about as in terms of organizers and people that are on the front lines? What are some of the recommendations you make along that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think so there are approaches that you could take when it comes to housing, right, if your goal is to create more racially integrated neighborhoods. And then there are approaches that you could take at the school district level. So to give an example of, you know, a win in housing, it's just kind of similar to what we mentioned before, doing the testing for racial steering and making sure that people know that if they continue with these discriminatory practices, they're going to be held accountable, right? So a racism just settled, I think it was $165,000. They had a settlement because they found in Mineola that an owner of this big apartment building was caught racial steering, right? So I think when something like that hits the news, it kind of just sends a bit of a, you know, it sends a message that people are testing for this, that it's not, you know, going to be business as usual all the time, and we do need to start taking this very seriously. And then at the school district level, I think a really good example of a district that has a lot of courage, that has been extremely successful, is Rockville Center, right? Because another way that educational inequities are perpetuated within a school district is by tracking. And that's when you have you know, school classes that are honors classes and classes that are average, and then classes that are, I guess, they consider below average classes. And, you know, studies for the longest time have showed that Black and Latino students are systematically tracked into the lower tracks. Even if they have the capacity to succeed, from the beginning they're tracked in lower tracks, and then it's very hard to get out, right? Because, if you read studies on implicit bias and having lower expectations for Black and Latino students, and you can see this, that's one of the reasons why Black and Latino students are tracked into the lower tracks. So just to get back to Rockville Center, they completely did away with tracking. And they instituted an IB program, which is an international baccalaureate program, which gives really high standards for all students. So all students are expected to succeed if they go to Rockville Center, and if they're not doing well, they're given the support that's necessary to bring them up to that level. And for me, that's a really type of radical concept, and I think that's great. And I would like to see that, instituted in more school districts on Long Island.
It's powerful to hear that some school districts are taking those initiatives and have the resources and the foresight to understand how important this is. If you are just tuning in, you're listening to Behind the News Long Island, 99.5 FM, WBAI. This is my first time pitching. For those of you who don't know, we're seeking your support. You are listening to voices from your communities. If you're from Long Island, you know that you've tuned to this station, and the discussion is dominated by, I'd say the boroughs, but here you are in our, we have a program that's talking about what's going on in our communities and the impact that it has on the region. You've been listening to the voice of Olivia Ildefonso, who's a resident from Bethpage. She's a PhD student at the CUNY Center that's actually active out there in terms of trying to change the injustice and inequities that exist in the community. We're asking you that if you like this type of support, if you like this type of programming, if you want to hear more of this, make sure you use your phone, or you jump on the web and you donate to keep us up and growing and alive, so we can get more folks on these lines really talking about what's impacting our communities. Please call 212-209-2950. Again, that's 212-209-2950, or log on to GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org. And you can be a WBAI buddy, right? And something as little as $10 a month throughout the year that, automatically gets drafted from your checking account or your debit card or a MasterCard. All credit cards are accepted. Will go a long way in terms of making sure that we continue to grow this program. We're going to have, in the couple of weeks that we've been, on air, we've had, retired New York police officers that reside in our communities. We've had attorneys. We've had, the NYCLU, NYCC, social activists that are doing things in our community to make sure that we have a better Long Island. And the only way that happens is if you sort of take to the phones. We're going to take a short little break here, and we're going to bring you some more voices. Please make sure you log on. Think about, I'll give you a couple of minutes and come back with that information before we start our next segment, all right? That was Common. He's really doing something with that song. It's quite inspirational, and what better way to sort of start this pitch? As I mentioned at the end of last segment, we wanted to give you some information so that you can, dig a little deep in your pocket. And, we're not asking for a whole lot. I'm thinking about some of you that may walk into a coffee shop on a daily basis and pick up a cup of coffee. I'm thinking about students, that are going to college, that are going to high school even, that need this information. We need you to sort of be our messengers and contribute to this station. I think that if you're a parent or if there's a young person in your life, that you owe it to them to put them onto this station. This is a primer for any college course in terms of, whether it's economics, whether it's health, whether it's race, whether it's, issues, social issues that are impacting our communities on a daily basis. We need you to invest in us, and this is an investment that you get, that you get tenfold. So if you're someone, if 99.5 is registered to your radio station as a favorite radio station, but you haven't picked up that phone not once to give even $5, even $10, every little bit helps. If you're someone who's, put on a pair of jeans and you realize that there's $5 there that you didn't even realize you have, like since you didn't even realize you had them, why don't you just donate them? Give us a call, 212-209-2950. Again, that's 212-209-2950. Or on the website, go to GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org. Become a BIA buddy as little as $10 a month. Goes a really long way. We'd appreciate it. We are talking school segregation, and, we've had a great conversation with Olivia Ildefonso, who's doing some great work out on Long Island. Now we're going to switch gears. We have joining us by phone, Mr. Dr. Alan Singer, who's a professor of teaching literacy and leadership and the program director of graduate programs in social studies education at Hofstra. He is a former New York City high school social studies teacher and is an editor of the social science docket. He's the author of a number of articles, including Teaching Global History, New York and Slavery, Time to Teach the Truth. He's a regular contributor to the Huffington Post, and, he's ready to give us his take on these issues. Dr. Singh, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you very much for having me, Serge.
Listen, we're extremely happy that you were, able to join us. I know you're in the middle of teaching classes, and you took this break just for us. But I needed to add your voice to this theme. We're talking about education on Long Island and throughout New York State. The fact that it's still separate and unequal. You're in the trenches. You're an activist. You're out there. You're doing everything you can, and you're also in a classroom. What's your take on this issue and the way it's impacting our students? What are some of the things that we should be doing? Let me hear you.
Okay, Serge, first, I'm a white man. And when I speak to minority communities, when I speak with Black and Latino parents, I often start off, I say, look, before we begin, I want to make clear that I know I'm white. And people laugh, but they appreciate it because a lot of white people, they go into minority communities and they say, well, we're all colorblind. Search, nobody is colorblind. We live in a society where people are acutely aware of race and ethnicity. So I always start from that proposition. But then one of the things I raise is parents will say to me, well, if it's a good school, what difference does it make who's sitting next to my son? My son is doing his work. He's going to learn. In reality, there's an element of truth to that, but there's also an element that's not true. And what's not true is we live in a society where if your child goes to a segregated school, a racially, economically, and ethnically segregated school, the investment is not going to be made in that school. It's not going to be made in that child. On Long Island, you have two communities that are walking distance from each other. You have Hempstead, you have Garden City. And Hempstead has great students with great needs. Many students who are struggling with English, many students from poverty, with difficult life conditions. Their parents are working through jobs. They themselves did not get very far in school. Those students need much greater support. But the support is not given to those schools. The money is funded locally, and the money goes into the more affluent communities like the neighboring Garden City. One of the things that I've always advocated is why aren't Garden City and Hempstead merged? Why don't we have one school system on Long Island so that kids can learn to live together? We have the same situation with Belmore Merrick and Roosevelt. You could take the Roosevelt School District, combine it with the Belmore Merrick District, it would still be a large majority white kids. It would be a multi-ethnic district that would offer great education to all kids. But it's not being done. So the thing I always say is, you're right. In the ideal world, we don't have to have racially, economically, and ethnically integrated schools. But in the world we live in, unless a minority kid goes to a racially integrated school, they're not going to make an investment in his or her education. That's the way it is.
If you're a Caucasian parent in a school that is performing well, and you sort of alluded to it before, why should that parent get up and go advocate and be fierce, particularly if, let's say, financially they feel like they're stable, they're happy with their property taxes. A number of folks go deliberately selected communities based on the school performance. Why should I now, as a parent, with kids who are performing well, why should I make this my issue?
There's a very good answer to that. In Nassau County, we have Roosevelt Field Mall, one of these giant super malls where all the kids like to go and shop for the latest stuff. If you want to prepare kids to live on Roosevelt Field Mall, then you can have racially segregated schools. But if you want to prepare kids, everybody says we want to prepare our kids to live in the 21st century. 21st century is a very, very diverse world where ascending nations in China and in India and in South Africa and in Brazil. And if a white parent wants their child to be prepared to live and prosper, do well in a very diverse world, and they want their child to have experiences with diverse groups of people. If all they want them to do is to go to Roosevelt Field Mall and shop, then they'll do all right in Coral Place, a segregated white town. But if they want them to have the opportunity to mix with the diverse populations of our world, then we want to start in elementary school. We want to start in middle school, giving them experiences with kids who are different from them.
Currently, there is neighboring to Roosevelt, right, which you were just discussing. The Belmore Merrick School District, I believe I saw in my local news channel, is dealing with some constraints, and it has everything to do with this idea that we have to start testing our kids, and clearly these are mandates coming down from the executive, and there's a lot of there's this idea of tests being the best indicator in terms of leveling the playing field. But you have the Belmore Merrick School District, which is a predominantly Caucasian district.
Yeah, 95% of it.
Certainly. Okay, so 95% Caucasian, and the superintendent and administrators are actually proposing the cutting of a Spanish language program, and the parents are up in arms. And, these are Caucasian parents that, we saw in the local news and in the local paper saying absolutely not. And they attest to that. What is it that they get that other parents don't?
Well, I think what you're looking at is a district where parents want their kids to go to elite colleges. And so they're looking at what does my kid need on his resume application for an elite college. And if you're not providing my kid with that, then the parents are very upset. I'm not sure the parents' commitment is diversity. I think their commitment is to social mobility for their own kids. This is what I would say. If you mixed Roosevelt students in with Belmore Merrick, this would not be a busing plan. This would be a walking plan. Kids from Roosevelt could walk to the schools in Belmore Merrick just as over the Washington Bridge over the Meadowbrook. Kids from Belmore Merrick could walk to the schools in Roosevelt. What I would like to see is the state coming up with a plan how to promote diversity in our schools so that all our students get to learn and live together. It could be done. It may not be possible everywhere. In New York City is so large, there are very real problems. It may not be possible everywhere, but in New York State, it will be possible in many places. And Nassau County, Long Island, Suffolk County, Long Island, are places where it can be done.
When you think about, I mean, you didn't get an opportunity to hear Olivia. I don't know how much of that you heard, but Olivia was talking about the fact that some of these things we're gonna have to get into some dire situations so that individuals could most likely be driven to the point of merging based on mostly economics, right? The fact that it's getting difficult, and I'm synthesizing, Olivia, so I apologize for anything that that I didn't get correct in that, but. Dr. Singer, is the financial implication maybe a way that we can sort of pull at the heartstrings of some individuals that may be completely opposed? And I'm thinking about maybe not merging schools completely in the beginning, but having, getting some of these school districts to even talk about their purchasing power and coming together to do some of that. And, maybe even social justice agencies. I know that, Erase Racism and other organizations are talking about bringing students together. They bring them together on a regular basis to have them share. What are your thoughts? How do we get the ball moving? How do we get it moving? Get that needle moving in the right direction?
Well, I don't think heartstrings is going to work, but it just might, because Long Island has 124 micro school districts with a lot of very heavy overhead. So as district budgets get tight, parents might be willing to consolidate so that they could share overhead expenses. That might be something that will work. But I think this idea of paring expense through consolidation has to be combined with a commitment to the advantage of
Mario is
diversity
on the line
for
right now.
all of our young people. It's a diverse world, and we have to prepare our young people for that world. People are going to act based on self-interest, I think, primarily, not based on caring about other people. Maybe later they'll care about other people. But right now they have to believe that this is going to benefit their kids. And again, they could save money through consolidation, but fundamentally their kids will be better prepared for living in a diverse world. My children and my grandchildren went to diverse schools in Brooklyn. And our family made that decision because we felt they would benefit by being engaged with kids who were different from them. And they all survived. They all did well. They're all educated. So it didn't undermine their education. And they went to school with diverse populations. That's the decision that we made as a family. And that's the decision I recommend.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Singer, for your insight and your thoughts on this issue. Listen, I know you're in between classes and, you took a break just to fit us in. We're extremely thankful for that. And, we're going to try and work something out so I could have you on for much longer. I'm sure that we could talk about a number of issues and all of your work. Thank you so much for the work that you do. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much for having me.
All righty.
And good luck to you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. And now, I'm honored to actually be bringing on the station manager here at WBAI. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure of working with. I know him. I met him first as Professor Mario Murillo, and now he's a colleague of sorts. He's also like a boss here, even though this is a voluntary position. I'm extremely excited to have him on. Mario, bienvenido, hermano. How are you, brother?
Oh man, that's like an uppercut to the jaw. That term.
Listen, now you know what it is. I'm trying to tell people that we do this out of the love for community, right? Like I'm joking with you, but we do it for the love of community. We do it for the love of strengthening the knowledge base that our young people and that individuals, our neighbors, are sort of gaining from having access to the station. So talk to me, brother. How are you?
Well, it's great to hear your voice on the air, Serge. And first, just a clarification. You just gave me a promotion. I'm not station manager. That general manager position belongs to Bertolt Reimers. But I'm still interim program director for the next. We're in a transition phase as we figure out what to do next. But it's been a great experiment these last 6 months, trying to move the station in a new direction, including this 5 o'clock programming time slot for the entire week, where we're trying to once again revive the strength of local voices doing local issues that have global implications. And I always thought that you, Serge, as as an activist, as a community organizer, as somebody who's engaged on so many different fronts on Long Island and in the region, I thought this would be a really interesting platform for you to engage with the WBAI community, not only on Long Island, but the entire tri-state listening area. And I think people in Yonkers, I think people in Newark, I think people in here in the New York City area, in Queens, in Brooklyn, elsewhere, and of course on Long Island could really relate, and the issues that you deal with resonate with families and communities across the tri-state area. And I really think what you've been bringing to the station these last few months has been unique, has been a voice, and you've been bringing on voices that have not been heard traditionally in the New York metro area. And that's one of the reasons why we support and celebrate community radio. We celebrate WBAI, and we're asking people to show their support for what you have been doing and what hopefully we'll continue to be doing in the coming weeks and months ahead. So, as we embark on this winter membership drive, it's great to have you on the air, Serge. I think the issues that you've been dealing with, from the education, the profound issues that you're drawing attention to in terms of education on Long Island, to the issue of addiction, heroin addiction, a wonderful program. Well, wonderful, maybe not the word. It was a jaw-dropping, almost shocking program that you did a few weeks ago on the issue of heroin addiction on Long Island, issues around police and community relations, police violence against communities of color on Long Island, issues of the prison, the school-to-prison pipeline. All these different issues that you've been drawing our attention to has been very important for the overall mission and state of the station, and we really appreciate what you do. And so I'm hoping, and I'm pretty sure, I'm rolling the dice, but I think people, whether they're on Long Island or elsewhere, listening to your show, are going to respond. We don't need to sell a premium. We don't need to pitch any specific premiums to get them to go to the airwaves. I'm counting on people embracing the goodwill, the energy, the commitment that you've brought to the station up to now, that people will respond and call in the number. The number to call is 212-209-2950. Community radio is a precious resource. It's not there forever. It won't be there forever if there's not a collective effort. It is a group community effort to keep WBAI alive and strong. And we're asking you right now to take this moment to pledge your support and join WBAI as we move forward into 2015 with so many challenges ahead. Serge, I thank you for the time and commitment that you're putting in. I know you're very busy, not only with your own work and your job, not only with all the activism, organizing you're doing on so many different fronts on Long Island, but obviously your beautiful family, that you take time off every week to come into the studio in Harlem to bring these voices onto the airwaves. And that's what we salute, and that's what makes WBAI a special place, and we thank you for it.
Mario, listen, it's truly a pleasure, and thank you so much for joining us. I know how busy you are too. Just so the listeners are aware, these individuals that are coming here, and we have Antonio Kelly from Picture This, who's recording this free of charge, taking a ride with me and taking pictures of all this work, and we're putting it on Facebook. Make sure you follow us on Behind the News Long Island. Really start looking into this. If you want to be a panelist, if there's an issue that's near and dear to you, please send us an email, behindthenewsli@gmail.com. Talk to us about things that are impacting your community. Join us every Tuesday from 5 to 6 p.m. Spread the word. Please make sure that you go out and get involved. Make sure you donate to WBAI. And we're going to end it like we always do. One mic, one voice. It's not your community. It's not my community. It's our community. And if we don't take care of it, who will? Peace. Strong Island, stand up.
Check. Hey, yo, it's time. Hey, yo, it's time. It's time. Hey, yo, it's time. We interrupt your programming to bring it to you live from the front lines. Strong Island where the gangs fleeing one time. Police is brutal like the streets is. Let my speech increase the peace through your speakers. Beat our weakness, of course, is division. Caused by religion, race, poor, be in prison way more than the rich ones. The laws of the pawns for position. My flow exposed flaws in the system. Look, you can't afford to be a bystander. Behind the news, where the lies die, we strive for high standards. The real power's in the hands hands of the people. Politics, propaganda, it's all see-through, and that's word that serves. The time is now for the youth in our roots. Gotta stand our ground. Listen Tuesdays at 5. Tune in to 99.5 East Ways, reporting live behind the news. Give your radio a break from the norm as we advocate for change and reform. Behind the news, unifying while exposing the counterfeits. It's the new voice of empowerment. Behind the new platform for the people it serves, where the truth in your speakers emerge. Behind the new, where politics meet their limitations, you get the real, never imitation. Behind the news, it's time.